Ibrahim Traoré was about to board Zeppelin when he read the message on his phone. French visa denied. This insult would become the beginning of a new African unity. The presidential motorcade had just arrived at Ouagadougou International Airport under the harsh West African sun. Military personnel stood at attention, their uniforms crisped despite the humid heat. Officials from various ministries had gathered on the tarmac, a sea of formal attire and expectant faces. The red carpet stretched from the motorcade to the stairs of the presidential aircraft, a symbol of diplomatic protocol that had been meticulously prepared for this significant occasion. This trip had been planned for months, Traoré's first official visit to Paris as Burkina Faso's president. The agenda included meetings with the French presidential Canuck ministers and business leaders. At stake were crucial negotiations about resource contracts, security cooperation, developmental aid for a country. Rule such high-level diplomatic engagement was vital if delicate Traoré stepped out of his vehicle, acknowledging salutes with the measured composure that had become his trademark at 34. He was among Africa's youngest leader, shaving risen to power. Through a commitment to national sovereignty, that resonated deeply with the population. Tired of foreign influence, masquerading as precannership, his foreign minister Amadou Ouedraogo approached immediately, his normally impassive diplomatic face praying unusual tension. He held with his phone. "Mr. President, there's a situation," he said quietly, ensuring his words wouldn't carry to the assembled dignitaries. Traoré took the device, scanning the email displayed on the screen. The message from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs was brief and coldly formal. The French Republic regrets to inform that the visa request for Ibrahim Traoré has been denied under Article 32 of the Visa Code on grounds of national security. The scheduled meetings with French officials hereby cancelled. Traoré read the message twice, his expression unchanged around him. The farewell ceremony concluded. The military band prepared to play the national anthem. Officials waited to make their formal goodbyes, unaware of the diplomatic earthquake that had just occurred. "Your orders, Cyrus T. Ouedraogo," his voice barely audible. Traoré handed back the phone. "No announcement yet. Let's move to the VIP lounge." As they walked across the tarmac meeting, the appearance of Traoré's mind raced through the implications. This was unprecedented. Former colonial power denying entry to the head of state of its former colony, a country where France still maintained significant economic interests. Thiedemann was clearly deliberate, calculate for maximum humiliation, waiting until he was literally about to board the plane with all ceremonial preparations. Kampal, in the privacy of the airport's VIP lounge, his security team and close advisors gathered faces. Gravis Ouedraogo explained the situation. "This is a direct response to your uranium mining decision last month," said Defense Minister Kabar, a veteran military officer whose loyalty to Burkina Faso had been proven through decades of service. Either sending a message, true, nodded 3 weeks earlier. He had announced the cancellation of a mining contract that had given a French corporation exclusive rights to Burkina Faso's uranium deposits on terms highly unfavorable to the African nation. The decision had sent shockwaves through Paris. The terms wary essentially colonial. Traoré had explained it. His citizens, in a televised address, Burkina Faso received less than 10% oft value extracted, while our people suffered the environmental and health consequences. Stosto 00000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 could issue a formal protest, suggested Foreign Minister Wedra. Summon their ambassador for explanation. That's what they expect, said Finance Minister Swado, a sharp-minded economist who had studied in Paris before returning to serve her country. A tithless response. They can ignore while they continue economic pressure. They want us to feel, Small added, Traoré's chief of staff, to remind us that, despite our formal independency, still control access to international platforms. Traoré walked to the window, watching as the plane that was supposed to carry him to Paris was being prepared for departure. The Burkina flag painted on its tail caught morning sunlight, a symbol of sovereignty that suddenly seemed hollow in the face of such blatant disrespect. A moment of reflection, he turned it back to his team. Call the French ambassador. I want to see him in my office in 1 hour. Then, noticing the confusion on their faces, he added, "I'm not going to be on that plane, but it's not returning empty." Back at the presidential palace, Traoré sat at his desk, reviewing a hastily prepared dossier. It detailed French economists' interests. In Burkina Faso, mining operations, infrastructure contracts, import-export arrangements, the scale of continuing economic dominance, decade after formal independence, was strikingly laid out comprehensively. French companies controlled 67% of Burkina Faso industrial gold production, 89% of its uranium extraction, and held majority stakes in the country's telecontinent, banking and transportation sectors. This economic leverage had translated into political influence with previous governments avoiding any policies that might displease Paris. The intercombust. "Mr. President, the French ambassador has arrived. Send him in." Ambassador Jean-Marc Renaud entered with the practiced confidence of a veteran diplomat, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. Despite the heat, he represented a nation that had controlled this territory for over 60 years, shaping its institutions, economy, and even national identity. President. He began, his tone cordial but lightly condescending. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your visa application." His voice lively. "Your government has made its position quite clear." Has slid a document across the desk. "This is an order expelling 34 French diplomats, including yourself. You have 48 hours to leave the country." Renaud's diplomat composure cracked momentarily, eyes widening as he processed the directive. "This is an extreme overreaction that will damage relations were damaged when your government denied entry to a head of state." Traoré said calmly, "But this expulsion isn't retaliation, it's an accessory security measure, after all, if I am considered a security threat to France. Clearly your diplomatic presence poses a similar threat to Burkina Faso. Consequences will be severe." Renaud warned, his tone hardening. "Economic cooperation, development aid, security assistance." "Let me be clear, Ambassador," Traoré said, rising from his chair. "This isn't a negotiation, it's a notification. 48 hours. After Renaud left, Traoré sat silently for several minutes, weighing the path he had just committed to their would-be consequences: economic pressure, potential destabilization, media campaigns portraying him as an irrational radical. France possessed powerful tools to punish African nations that challenge its influence, but there was also opportunity. The visa denial was so blatantly disrespectful that it provided perfect justification for what Traoré had been restructuring of the post-colonial relationship that kept African nations perpetually subordinate to their former rulers. He began making a series of calls to his counterparts across West Africa. The presidents of Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Senegal followed a similar pattern explanation of the situation. Discussion of France's continuing economic dominance in the region, and a proposal thought surprised even his closest advisors. "This isn't just about Burkina Faso," he told Niger's president, whose country similar challenges with French uranium mining operations. "It's about dignity for all our nations. The response must be collective." To Mali's President Inthuo had recently faced French criticism for seeking security partnerships outside traditional Western allies. He was even more direct. "They use the same playbook against all of us. Diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, security threats. We've been fighting separately and losing. It's time to stand together." Evening. Traoré addressed his nation. A televised broadcast at his desk, with the Burkina Faso flag behind him. He explained the situation with a calm precision that had become his trademark. "Citizens of Burkina Faso today, or former colonial power, attempted to humiliate not just me, but our entire nation by denying a visa to your democratically chosen president. France has shown that in their eyes we remain subject, not equal." Z outlined the expulsion of French diplomats, then continued, "But this incident reveals a deeper truth we must confront. 60 years after independence, our economies, our resources, even our diplomatic standing gear, still controlled by former colonial powers. True sovereignty remains elusive." The broadcast was being watched, not just in Burkina Faso, but across West African Mali. President Dio nodded in agreement, and Senegal President Mbe took notes. In Niger, President Issoufou called an emergency cabinet meeting even before Traoré finished speaking. "Tomorrow," Traoré continued, "I will propose to our African brothers and sisters a new path for regional diplomatic reciprocity. pact will ensure that no African nation stands alone when faced with diplomatic. As he concluded his address, social media across the continent exploded with reactions. The hashtag #AfricanDignity began trending, with millions sharing their own experiences of visa denials, diplomatic humiliations, and unequal treatment theft. Morning, the French government woke to a diplomatic crisis that was spiraling beyond their control. Not only had Burkina Faso expelled their diplomatic mission, but Mali and Niger had announced similar measures. Senegal, traditionally France's most stable ally, the region had recalled its ambassador from Paris for consultations. In simple message to Traoré to back off on themining contracts, an aide told the foreign minister, "How did it escalate so quick?" I underestimated him. The minister replied grimly, "And we failed to account for regional solidarity." Get that president on the line. This is becoming a strategic crisis. Meanwhile, in Abuja, Nigeria, an emergency session of ECOWAS Community of West African States had been convened at Burkina Faso's request. Traoré stood before his fellow leaders, presenting what would soon be known as the Ouagadougou Protocol. For too long we have accepted an unequaled political relationship with our Merkelizers, he said to the assembled residents and prime ministers. Their citizens travel freely to our countries, while our citizens, even government officials, face humiliating visa processes and arbitrary denials. Laid out a simple but revolutionary process. Any diplomatic restriction imposed on one ECOWAS member state or its officials by an African nation would automatically trigger reciprocal asterisks from all ECOWAS members as standardized visa policy toward former colonial powers, ensuring that their citizens face the same requirements and costs that African citizens faced when traveling to those countries. Establishment of an ECOWAS diplomatic response unit to coordinate reactions to future diplomatic slights or pressure tactics isn't about antagonism. Traoré emphasized his voice, echoing through that chamber. It's about equality, about being treated as sovereign nations, not former colonies. Nigeria's president, whose country was the region's economic warehouse, raised a practical concern. Economic implications could be severe: tourism, business ties, investment flows, precisely the leverage they always used against us. Trop counter a threat that challenging the status quo will lead to economic harm. But consider this: what is the cost of continuing to accept diplomatic inequality? What is the price of perpetual subordination? Ghana's president, a respected elder statesman, added, "Slowly for decades, we've been told that real independence would come through economic development. Yet, that development has been structured time and dependency. Perhaps true development begins with standing up for our dignity." As the ECOWAS leaders debated the proposal, France was mobilizing its diplomatic machinery. Calls were made to friendly African leaders. Economic crucial points were identified. Media narratives were crafted portraying Traoré's an impulsive, radical, destabilizing drugal relations. But something next was happening. The story of the visa denial had struck a chord across Africa. Social media was ablaze. Hashtags like #AfricanDignity and #No More Colonialist Brits gathered outside Chambassis in Dar Abjan and Kinshasa University. Students organized debates about neo-colonialism and diplomatic severity. Most significantly, African business leaders and intellectuals were speaking out. A group of prominent reporters issued a statement supporting diplomatic reciprocity and calling for reduced economic dependency on former colonial powers. The notion that African economies cannot function without preferential relationships with former colonizers is itself a colonial mindset, wrote a renowned Senegalese economist. We have the resources, Thitolen, and increasingly the capital, to chart our own economic course. 3 days after the visa denial, the ECOWAS summit concluded with a historic announcement. The Ouagadougou Protocol had been adopted unanimously. 15 West African nations had agreed to stand as one in diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. In Paris, the implications were sinking. In France, maintained varying degrees of economic and political influence across its former colonial empire, an arrangement that relied on bilateral relationships where power imbalances could be exploited. Front fundamentally changed that equation. The French president called an emergency meeting with his foreign policy team. We need to de-escalate, he instructed. Traoré a personal apology, blamed the visa denial on a bureaucratic error, get our diplomats back in place before we lose control of the narrative. It's too late for that. His Africa advisor replied, The Ouagadougou Protocol has already expanded diandist. African nations are express in Genesis. The African Union is holding a special session to discuss continuity diante. How did a simple visa denial lead to this? The president, a sked buildered by the rapidly evolving situation. It wasn't the denial itself explained. A senior diplomat who had served in multiple African postings, it was the timing, the deliberate emulation. Traoré used it as a catalyst for something that's been building for years: resentment against the persistent inequality in our diplomatic relations. In Ouagadougou Traoré, the news of ecosystem unanimous decision with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about personal vindication, but about a principle that transcended Dinaval leaders or nations. His phone rang, a secure line. Used for confidential contentions between heads of state, it was the French president calling directly for the first time President Traoré. The voice began without preamble. This situation has escalated dynastically. I want to personally assure you that the visa denial was a regrettable administrative error. We would like to welcome you to Paris at your earliest convenience to resolve animus and response. You for your call, Mr. President. Traoré replied, but this is no longer about a visa or a visit. The Ouagadougou Protocol isn't directed against France Pacific, but addresses a broader imbalance in international relationships. Protocol effectively holds French citizens hostage to political disputes. French president objected at Wildemage, business ties, tourism, educational ex-designings, perspective. Traoré said African citizens have faced those exact constraints for decades. The difference is that now the situation is reciprocal. After the call, Traoré's foreign minister looked concerned. They'll retaliate economically, aid cuts, investment freezes, restrictions. Undoubtedly Traoré agreed, which is why the diplomatic front is just the beginning phase. To address this economic sovereignty, the next week saw a flurry of diplomatic activity across Europe and Africa. France attempted to divide the ECO's unity by offering special relationships to individual countries. The EU expressed deep concern about the reciprocal visa regulations. In Tarian media debated whether Africa was taking a radical turn. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré continued building on the momentum. In a virtual summit with other ECOWAS leaders, have presented the second phase of what was now being called the Ouagadougou Doctrine. Diplomatic sovereignty is mythical swift. Economic sovereignty, he told his counterparts, the leverage our former hold over us isn't just a budvisis, an official recognition. It's about our resources, our markets, our financial systems. The proposal was ambitious, a gradual restructuring of economic relationships with former colonial powers, prioritizing in trade, establishing an Anacos investment bank to reduce dependence on foreign capital, and coordinated renegotiation of resource extraction contracts. We're not calling for isolation or economic warfare. Traoré emphasized we're calling for partnership based on mutual benefit, then continued extraction as the summit progressed. News arrived that further strengthened the African position. China and Russia had announced that they would recognize and respect the Ouagadougou Protocol with simplified visa procedures for all ECOWAS citizens. Turkey, Brazil, and India quickly followed suit. This is not a Western influence with Eastern influence, Traoré clarified. When questioned about these developments, it's about diversifying our international relations to create genuine choices. Any nation that treats us with respect will find us ready to engage. The global diplomatic lens was shifting. Former colonial powers were losing their privileged decks to African markets and resource, while emerging powers were establishing new relationships based on the principles of the Ouagadougou Protocol. 2 weeks after the initial visa denial, the French government announced a complete reversal of its position. Not only was President Traoré welcome in France, but a new simplified visa system would be implemented for all citizens of former French colonies. But it was too late to return to the status quo. The momentum bend. The Ouagadougou Protocol and doctrine had grown beyond any single control at an extraordinary of the African Union. In Addis Ababa Protocol was adopted concentrating the most unified African diplomatic position since the organization's founding. Ibrahim Traoré is invited to address the OAS 54 African nations. He reflected on how far a simple visa denial had led distinguished colleagues. The true significance of the Ouagadougou Protocol is not in its specific provisions. He began it as in what it represents. Africa speaking with one voice, standing as equals in the international community. as supplicants or former subjects, he continued, his voice growing stronger. For centuries, the narrative about Africa has been, written by others, our resourcelessly labeled discoveries when Europeans found what we already knew existed, our borders drawn in European capitals. Without regard for our people's realities, our economic value, measured only in what could be extracted, not what could be built. The assembly was silent, absorbed in his words. That narrative is ending not because we reject partnership with a wider world, but because true partnership can only exist between equals. The Ouagadougou Protocol is simply a statement of that equality. A declaration thought Africa's dignity is non-negotiably, as Traoré concluded. His address, the assembly rose in a standing ovation. The message was clear: a new era in international relations had begun, catalyzed by a simple, denied visa, and transformed by a leader who saw opportunity in insult. In the months that followed, the Ouagadougou Doctrine expanded by diplomacy and basic economics. African nations began coordinated goings on climate negotiations, trade agreements, and international security matters. Intra-African trade increased dramatically as artificial colonial gave way to more natural regional relationships. Perhaps most significantly, a psychological barrier had been broken: the presumption of Western preeminence in international relations, a legacy of colonialism that had persisted decades after formal was finally binclinked systematically a year after the visa incident. Ibrahim Traoré did finally visit Paris, but not on the terms originally planned. He arrived as co-chair of a new EU partnership payments established to between the continents on a basis of genuine equality. As his planet touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport, he received a message from the Burkina ambassador to France: red carpet and full honors awaiting you, Mr. President. How times have changed. Traoré smiled burning that day at Ouagadougou Airport. Then he had read the visa denial notice. Ibrahim Traoré had been about to board the plane when he read the message on his phone. French visa denied. That insulted indeed become the beginning of a new unity, one that was transforming just Africa but the entire international order.